arrogance, fraud, and an extraordinary descent. Observe the inadequacy of a man's fortune in the face of justice. Tension crackled in the air as the discussion in the courtroom buzzed like a hive of agitated bees. The defendant's table was the focal point of their attention as individuals crowded the benches, shoulder to shoulder. Each passing rumor was more scandalous than the previous one, as whispers were exchanged between individuals. Afterward, he entered the room. The individual was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a charcoal grey designer suit. His confidence was at times borderline arrogant. He beamed at the audience, as if the room had convened to venerate him, not condemn him, and his slick-back hair gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Ethan Grayson. Rather than a defendant accused of plundering millions from struggling families, the name that had dominated headlines for weeks appeared to be a guest of honor. However, it was not his entrance that captured the attention of the audience. It was the arrival of Judge Monica Lee to the courtroom. Judge Lee approached the bench with a subdued authority, clad in her black robe. She did not require to elevate her voice or look at the audience in order to elicit respect. Her mere presence sufficed. She was a judge who prioritized justice and was known for her uncompromising approach. The bailiff announced, "All rise in honor of the Honorable Judge Monica Lee," and everyone rose, all individuals with the exception of Ethan Grayson. A hush descended upon the chamber. All eyes were directed toward the defendant, who remained seated and leisurely perused a legal pad, as if the proceedings were a minor inconvenience. With a dismissive flick of his wrist, Ethan dismissed his counsel, who had approached him with an urgent murmur. Judge Lee's gaze was penetrating as she paused at her bench. The silence intensified with each passing second, despite the fact that her visage revealed nothing. The crowd's disbelief was tangible, as a murmur reverberated throughout. Who was this individual under the impression that he was? However, Ethan did not hesitate. He was almost defying the judge to react with his arrogant expression. "You may be seated," Judge Lee stated, her tone remaining composed yet authoritative. The affront was not addressed by her. Not yet. However, the ambiance of the room had undergone a transformation. At this moment, the tension was not only tangible, it was oppressive. However, this was merely the beginning. Even the wealthiest and most entitled individuals are not immune to the law, as Ethan Grayson was about to discover the hard way. Ethan Grayson was not a typical individual of considerable fortune. He possessed the type of wealth that garnered attention: luxury yachts, multi-million-dollar residences on both coasts, private aircraft, and parties that could rival celebrity galas. Grayson Investments, his business enterprise, was once celebrated as a symbol of financial prosperity. However, the glitter and grandeur conceal a more sinister reality. Grayson's ascent to the summit had been predicated on deception. He had persuaded hundreds of small business owners and middle-class families to invest their life resources in fraudulent enterprises, offering them the opportunity to secure their futures. Even entire family inheritances, retirement accounts, and education funds, gone in the twinkling of an eye. The consequences were catastrophic. Families were displaced from their residences. Feeding their offspring was a challenge for parents. The possibility of living out their final years in destitution was a horrifying prospect for elderly couples. His avarice had a far-reaching impact. However, to Ethan, it was merely business. The evidence was astonishing when investigators ultimately apprehended him. A damning picture was painted by bank records, falsified documents, and testimony from former employees. However, despite the barriers closing in, Ethan maintained his confidence. He had informed reporters outside his Malibu residence, "I have the most exceptional attorneys that money can buy. This situation will eventually resolve itself. It consistently occurs." For a brief period, it appeared that he may be correct. The trial was postponed for months as his legal team submitted motion after motion. They depicted him as a disoriented entrepreneur, a scapegoat for the failings of others. However, the grief of his victims and the mountain of evidence could not be erased by any amount of legal maneuvering. The courtroom was filled daily with individuals seeking justice, or at least some semblance of it. By the time the trial ultimately commenced in San Francisco, Angela Martinez, a bereaved mother of 3, had lost her property after investing with Grayson. She was one of them. Her youngest daughter had been compelled to withdraw from college. Peter Vaughn, a retired firefighter, who had spent decades accumulating for retirement, was seated beside her. However, he ultimately found himself residing in his brother's spare room. The trial featured the sharing of their stories, as well as those of innumerable others. in a manner that was gut-wrenching. Angela's voice broke as she recounted the day she realized she was unable to make the mortgage payment. She, with tears streaming down her face, begged them not to take the house. However, they showed no concern. For a period of 2 weeks my children were compelled to slumber in our vehicle. Are you familiar with the sensation that results? Peter's testimony was equally distressing. He said, his voice heaving with rage, I spent 35 years running into burning buildings. And this man, he destroyed my future without a second thought. But Ethan remained seated, unperturbed, throughout the entire ordeal. He frequently reclined in his chair, either scrolling through his phone, or muttering quips to his attorney. According to him, these were mere narratives. He believed that the outcome was already in his favor, and the clamor was irrelevant. The press devoured it. His arrogance, lack of remorse, and the audacious disdain he had demonstrated to the court were all trumpeted in the headlines. He was facing a decline in public support. However, Ethan was indifferent. In his view, public opinion did not compose checks. His attorney attempted to manipulate the narrative. Mr. Grayson deeply regrets any hardship that may have been caused, the attorney stated at a press conference. However, he is adamant that the truth will ultimately prevail. Nevertheless, the reality was that Ethan had no intention of acknowledging his remorse. He was placing a wager that the system would adjust in his favor, as it had always done in the past. However, this time, Ethan neglected to consider a single factor. The individuals with whom he was accustomed were not like Judge Monica Lee. The trial was a spectacle. The streets surrounding the courthouse were lined with news vehicles, and correspondents were vying for a vantage point to capture every detail. Inside, the tension continued to escalate. As the days progressed, witness after witness appeared on the stand, each one contributing another nail to the metaphorical coffin of Ethan Grayson. However, it was not solely the testimonies that elicited murmurs from the audience. It was also Ethan's conduct. The prosecution presented incriminating evidence on the third day of the trial, a series of emails in which Ethan explicitly instructed his team to falsify records and mislead investors. As the prosecutor read his words aloud, the courtroom was devoid of noise. Ensure that the figures are visually appealing. We require these individuals to sign on the dotted line. The words hovered in the air like poison. Angela Martinez, who was seated in the front row, shook her head in disbelief. Peter Vaughan's hands were clenched. Additionally, what about Ethan? He grinned. The prosecutor's voice was piercing as she turned toward him. Mr. Grayson, are you familiar with this email? Before he could respond, his attorney intervened. Objection. This inquiry has been addressed and resolved during pre-trial hearings. Judge Lee raised her hand, her demeanor remaining composed yet authoritative. The decision has been overturned. The defendant will respond to the inquiry. Ethan's tone was reeking of condescension as he leaned into the microphone. Certainly, I am aware of it. However, let us not feign that it conveys the meaning you are suggesting. It is merely business-related discourse. You would be incapable of comprehending the situation. The judge's gavel struck like a thunderclap, and the crowd erupted in murmurs. Order in the court. Judge Lee's voice pierced the background noise. She resumed her focus on Ethan. Mr. Grayson, I suggest that you be mindful of your tone. This meeting is not conducted in a boardroom. However, Ethan did not hesitate. He appeared to be entertained, as if this were merely a complex game. His arrogance increased as the trial progressed. He interrupted witnesses with sarcastic laughter, rolled his eyes during cross-examinations, and whispered openly to his counsel during critical moments. Incredulous, the audience observed him treating the courtroom as if it were his personal stage. The following day was the day of Angela Martinez's testimony. She ascended to the platform, her hands quivering as she held a folded piece of paper. She began with a trembling voice, but her words were laden with the weight of her anguish. She gazed directly at Ethan and stated, I trusted him. I entrusted him with all of my possessions, and he shattered the future of my family. Ethan did not even glance at her. He leisurely scrolled through his phone while leaning back in his chair. The prosecutor interrupted, pointing toward Ethan, and said, Your Honor, the defendant is evidently not paying attention to the witness. Her countenance was impassive, but her eyes were ablaze with quiet wrath, as all eyes were directed toward Judge Lee. Mr. Grayson, she said, her voice measured, Please put your phone away, immediately. He peered up, unperturbed. I was simply verifying a critical matter, he stated, gesturing to the device, as if to substantiate his assertion. The judge's demeanor became more stern. I stated it at this time. There was a brief period when it appeared as though he might dispute, but he reluctantly put down the phone. The tension in the room was tangible, but the harm had already been inflicted. Angela's testimony persisted, but her voice was tinged with skepticism, as if she was unable to comprehend the absence of fundamental human decency. The courtroom was filled with tears by the conclusion of her statement, with the exception of Ethan's. The defense was left to make their move after the prosecution rested its case a week later. Ethan's attorney pursued every possible strategy, including the portrayal of Ethan as a victim of unscrupulous prosecutors, the distortion of the narrative, and the discreditation of witnesses. However, the fractures were too extensive to conceal. Judge Lee maintained her composure throughout the entire ordeal. She rarely spoke, but her presence hovered over the room like a steadfast, unwavering force. It was evident to all who observed that her tolerance for Ethan's hijinks was waning. The trial had concluded, the anticipation was nearly insufferable, and the air in the courtroom was electrifying. The rear sections were occupied by reporters, who were prepared with their cameras and pens. The gallery was crowded with victims, whose expressions were a combination of optimism and fury. Judge Monica Lee was the focus of attention as she prepared to administer the sentence. Ethan Grayson maintained his usual relaxed demeanor, while seated at the defense table. Even as the cameras captured his every move, he had the audacity to show a small grin. He did not appear to be a man who was about to be judged. He appeared to be a man who was certain that he had already prevailed. The room fell silent when Judge Lee eventually spoke. "Grayson," she continued, her voice steady and deliberate, "you have been found guilty of all counts of obstruction of justice, conspiracy and fraud. The testimony of your victims provides a clear depiction of your actions, and the evidence against you is overwhelming. You have ruined the lives of countless individuals, manipulated them and exploited them for your own personal gain." Ethan's demeanor was unintelligible as he reclined in his chair. The adjudicator proceeded. "Your lack of remorse has been evident throughout this trial. Your conduct in this courtroom has been nothing short of reprehensible. You have treated these proceedings as if they were beneath you, disregarded the authority of this court, and insulted your victims." Angela Martinez, who was seated in the front row, clasped her hands firmly, her knuckles turning white. The audience murmured in agreement. The demeanor of Judge Lee underwent a change, as it became increasingly icy. "Justice, Mr. Grayson, is not a matter of privilege, power, or wealth. It pertains to accountability. Additionally, you will be confronted with the repercussions of your actions today." Ethan's smirk wavered for the first time as he straightened in his chair, as the room was so silent that the subtle rustling of paper could be clearly heard. Consequently, the judge proclaimed, "I impose a sentence of 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." Gasps erupted from the audience, and Ethan's visage was frozen as the blood drained from his cheeks. 25 years. He had anticipated a mere strike on the wrist, perhaps a few months in a luxurious facility. However, this was unprecedented for an individual of his caliber. Judge Lee was not yet completed. "Additionally, I am directing the immediate liquidation of your assets to compensate the victims of your criminal activities. Every dollar that you have stolen will be returned to the families that you have devastated." Peter Vaughan's eyes were wide with disbelief as he reclined back in his seat, and Angela Martinez clasped her palms to her lips, tears pouring down her face. The courtroom erupted into astonished murmuring. Ethan's visage was ablaze with rage as he arose from his chair. "You are incapable of accomplishing this," he bellowed, his voice reverberating throughout the room. "My name is Ethan Grayson. You are not permitted to treat me as a common criminal." Judge Lee's expression was unwavering as her gavel fell. "Mr. Grayson, please take a seat." However, Ethan was not yet completed. "This is a prank. I will file an appeal. Your career will be irreparably damaged, Judge." As the bailiffs approached, they prepared to intervene. Judge Lee maintained her composure, her voice piercing through his outburst like a stiletto. "This is my courtroom, Mr. Grayson. Additionally, you will demonstrate deference. Escort the defendant out."
bailiffs. Ethan's voice diminished with each step as he was led away, and he continued to protest. The courtroom erupted in applause, an uncommon occurrence that felt wholly fitting at the time. Judge Lee's demeanor marginally relaxed as she addressed the audience. She stated, "Justice has been served. Let this serve as a reminder that no one, regardless of their status, is above the law." However, as the courtroom deserted and the cameras outside began to flash, one query remained in the minds of all. Is this sentence sufficient to effect genuine transformation in an individual such as Ethan Grayson? The courtroom was nearly deserted at this point, with the exception of a few reporters who were still present and victims who were gathering their belongings. The air was still tinged with exhilaration. However, the emotions of those who were directly impacted by Ethan Grayson's crimes were more intricate. A reporter approached Angela Martinez with a microphone as she stood by the courthouse steps, gripping her purse securely. "What is your reaction to the verdict that was rendered today?" Angela hesitated before expressing her relief, stating, "I feel relieved. However, the reality is that no sentence will be able to undo the harm he has inflicted. My children and I are still in the process of re-establishing ourselves. However, we are currently optimistic." Peter Vaughan was conversing with an acquaintance in the vicinity. "It is not solely about the number of years he is accumulating," he stated, shaking his head. "It is about the message. People who are similar to him believe that they are invincible. Today serves as evidence that they are not." Judge Monica Lee sat calmly in her chambers, gazing out the window at the chaos below. She did not experience triumph or victory, rather she maintained a steadfast resolve. Her responsibilities were not centered on personal gratification, rather, they were designed to guarantee equity. They were intended to serve as a reminder that the scales of justice could be balanced, even in the face of affluence and privilege. Ethan Grayson's name would continue to receive media attention for an extended period of time. However, the chapter was eventually coming to a close for the individuals he had wronged. Many of them would be able to begin anew with the financial restitution. However, the scars he left behind would require a lengthier period of time to recover. The story ignited discussions throughout the nation as the weeks progressed, serving as a call to action for accountability, to ensure that those in positions of authority adhere to the same standards as the general populace. The verdict served as a source of inspiration for individuals as they recounted their own experiences of injustice. However, the most impactful moment may have been when Sophia, Angela's youngest daughter, composed a letter to Judge Lee that was subsequently published in a local newspaper. "I am grateful for your advocacy on behalf of my family. We are grateful for your demonstration that individuals such as Ethan Grayson are unable to evade the consequences of their actions. You did not merely render justice to us, you granted us a second opportunity." There was more to the narrative of Ethan Grayson's trial than mere courtroom drama. It served as a reminder of the resilience of ordinary individuals, the significance of integrity, and the conviction that justice can and should emerge, regardless of the circumstances. Therefore, as you contemplate this narrative, contemplate the following. What does accountability mean to you? And in your personal life, how can you guarantee that justice and impartiality are not merely ideals but rather actions? Ultimately, justice is not solely the province of the courts. It is a cause that we must all advocate for on a daily basis.